will need to.
Okay.
Yeah.
I hope I can be heard now.
Yes, you can.
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
sir.
Hello, how are
Hello,
you?
Prasun. Hello, Dr.
Hello,
Tieken.
hello, Professor Chakravarti.
Hello, sir. Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Good evening, everyone.
So,
Good
can we
evening.
start now?
Yes,
Yes,
of
sir. I
course.
think we're ready
Yes,
to
yes.
start now.
Shanmitra, are we on the floor?
We are.
Okay, thank you.
Uh,
So, good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome you all to the book launch and discussion of a special book on the Ashokan inscriptions. Special because any work on these inscriptions takes forward the tradition of a long and illustrious lineage of research and publication by scholars over almost 2 centuries. One can only imagine the expertise and experience required to be able to contribute something new and reconstruct or revise the readings, connections of these inscriptions with their context. So let us begin in anticipation of a wonderful evening of discussion and new observations on Dr. Herman Tieken's work, The Ashokan Inscriptions, Analyzing a Corpus. Without further ado, I would like to now introduce our author and the eminent panelists for this evening's book launch and discussion. Our author, Dr. Herman Tieken, is fellow at the Leiden Institute of Asian Studies at the University of Leiden, where he formerly taught Sanskrit as well as Tamil for many years. His areas of interest include Kavya literature in Sanskrit, Prakrit, and Apabhramsha, as well as Jain texts, classical Tamil poetry, and of course, the Ashokan inscriptions, with a focus on the arrangement and internal cohesion of texts that make up these inscriptions. Dr. Tieken has published widely on these topics, including Kavya in South India, Old Tamil Sangam poetry, and Between Colombo and the Cape, letters in Tamil, Dutch, and Sinhala sent to Nicholas Ondaatje from Ceylon, exile at the Cape of Good Hope, 1728 to 1737. Our first panelist today, Professor Ranabir Chakravarti's field of expertise is the history of early India. Besides having an enduring interest in the pre-modern maritime history of the Indian Ocean, Professor Chakravarti also specializes in the socio-economic and political history of pre-modern South Asia. We at Primus Books are proud to have published his works, The Pull Towards the Coast, The Indian Ocean History, and the Subcontinent Before 1500 CE, which was brought out in 2020, as well as the third edition of his Exploring Early India up to circa AD 1300. On the panel, we then have with us Professor Nayanjot Lahiri, who currently teaches history at Ashoka University. She has previously taught at the University of Delhi till 2015 and has been a visiting fellow at universities across the world, including Cambridge University and Harvard University. Professor Lahiri's research interests lie in the fields of ancient India, Indian archaeology, and heritage studies. This is reflected in her wide array of publications, some of which include Marshalling the Past, Ancient India and its Modern Histories, the prestigious John F. Richards prize-winning book, Ashok in Ancient India, and her recent Searching for Ashok, Questing for a Buddhist King from India to Thailand. We look forward to finally listening to the thoughts of Dr. Alastair Gornall, who is Assistant Professor in History and Religion at Singapore University of History and Design and a research associate in the Department of Languages and Cultures of South Asia at SOAS, University of London. His research focuses sorry, on the intellectual and cultural history of Buddhism in South and Southeast Asia. His publications include Rewriting Buddhism, Pali Literature and Monastic Reform in Sri Lanka, 1153 to 1270, and a co-edited volume, Pushpika, Tracing Ancient India Through Texts and Traditions. I would now like to invite Dr. Herman Tieken to talk about his book and introduce the work to us. After that, my colleague and editor, Ms. Jyotika Mansatta, will take the proceedings of the evening ahead. Dr. Tieken, please tell us about your book.
Thank you very much for these introductions. I have made some notes, so sometimes I will direct my eyes to my notes if I speak now. Am I clear to hear? Okay. I'd like to begin, of course, by thanking Primus Books for organizing this virtual book launch. It's not my first book, but it is the first one to be presented in this way to colleagues, friends, and not to forget family. Our sons are watching in their respective homes, and my wife in the next room. I hope she has her headphone on, otherwise she will hear an echo. She will hear me 2 times. We all hope that COVID will disappear for good, but as far as I'm concerned, Zoom meetings, which helped us through this crisis, may stay with us, I think. In this book, it is already mentioned just now, I've aimed to subject the text of the Aśoka Inscriptions to an ordinary form of close reading, which is what we Sanskritists usually do. You might ask, there are already numerous translations, so what is new? What is new is that I read the text of the inscriptions with 2 very specific questions in mind. Questions which are raised by the kinds of text we are dealing with, namely compilations of seemingly independent pieces of text called edicts, which form the author's collected works, in this case those of a king with imperial ambitions. What I've tried to find out is if it's possible to tease out signs of structure and organization in the compilations, which at first sight look like random collections of, loose edicts, you might say, and next to establish if and how the various texts of this author are connected, or in other words, if we are entitled to speak of a coherent corpus of texts. As far as the last question is concerned, of course, the answer is given away in the subtitle of the book, which is Analysing a Corpus. Another introductory remark I would like to make concerns my own credentials. My natural habitat as a scholar is Kavya literature, whether it's in Sanskrit, Prakrit, Upper Brahmsha, and Tamil. And it would hardly be a recommendation to have translated the Kama Sutra into Dutch and the erotic poems of the Satasai, Hala Satasai, into English, by the way, together with a friend, Peter Koroch. I have, of course, also dealt with other texts, literary texts, as well as learned treatises, but I'm not trained as an historian or archaeologist, and I'm not well versed in epigraphy either. Many of the findings in my book were arrived at by carefully reading the text with a fresh eye, and they do affect as such these and many other disciplines. In such cases, I have tried to formulate my conclusions in such a way that they will be useful for specialists in other relevant fields. I want to add, though, that I have decided not to focus on the fragmentary inscriptions in Afghanistan. They're well known. The study of these texts do not only require a thorough acquaintance with Greek and Aramaic, but also with knowledge of the history and archaeology of the region. qualifications which are outside my specific field of interest. In what follows, I will give a few examples of what I have found in the text and how these conclusions may affect the picture of ancient Indian history. Let us first take a look at the so-called Rock Edict series and the Pillar Edict series. These two compilations form a pair with a clear division of labor. The Rock Edict series is a compilation of 14 edicts that are engraved on freestanding boulders or pieces of rock at altogether 10 sites at the extreme borders of the realm. They are actually at the fuzzy edges of the South Asian subcontinent, if you look at the distribution. In these edicts, the king speaks mainly about himself and the efforts he has made to establish a benign rule. He does not tell his subjects what they should do or should not do. He must have realized, I think, that people living in such remote areas go their own ways anyhow, and that all he would be able to achieve is to convince them that they would not regret submitting themselves to his rule. The Pillar Edict series, on the other hand, is a compilation of 6 edicts that are engraved on a total of 6 pillars found in the Ganges basin. In this series, the king does mention instructions, specific instructions, which he had given to his subjects. For instance, when he gives a long list of animals that should not be killed or otherwise hurt on certain holy days. These inscriptions, in other words, read a completely different spirit than does the Rock Edict series. But then they are found in an area of which the king holds direct sway from his capital, Pataliputra. The two sets of inscriptions are therefore clearly complementary, and this becomes even more clear when we consider their respective epilogues. The Rock Edict series, that's the first one with 14 edicts and found at 10 sites around at the borders of India. The Rock Edict series ends with an edict, the 14th, about the importance of writing letters. Letters when the king, he needs them when he wants to communicate with people living in remote areas. In the Pillar Edict series, which are found near the administrative center in the Ganges basin, the king writes that letters are important, but that visiting the people in person is much more effective. Doing so would, of course, simply be impossible in the more remote areas. So you see, we have here 2 texts which have complementary messages, and they are found, you know, they talk to people where they are found, and they have a specific message for people at the borders and the others at the center. Together, the Rock Edict series and the Pillar Edict series give us an idea of how communication was arranged within the Maurya Empire, or even with people living across the border of that empire. And also of how, what the relationship was between center and periphery. But there is another point to consider here. The same 2 compilations form a pair in yet another way. I must begin by noting that the Pillar Edict, the Rock Edict series, is generally believed to have been composed, disseminated, and engraved in batches or successive installments. This idea was based, among other things, of the regnal years mentioned in the edicts. For instance, the 12th year of the king's reign is mentioned in edicts 3 and 4. The 13th year in Edict 5, the 10th year in Edict 8. And, oh no, sorry, now I'm, the 10th year is in 8, yes, and the 8th year is in Edict 13. However, these years do not go forward, they go backwards. You know, halfway the king turns in this series from his 13th year to the 8th year of his reign. So it's at first sight even not very logical that these edicts were composed, engraved in successive installments. More importantly, these years do not date the composition of the edicts, but they date events in the king's career. I can give an example. No, I first say the series appears to be built up with blocks of edicts, each of which describes and dates a particular turning point in the king's career. Thus, in the first edict, he informs us how he had reduced the consumption of meat in the palace. In Edict No. 5, how in the 13th year of his reign, he had instituted a new kind of office, namely the office of the Dharma Mahamatra. In the edicts, it explained what kind of office that is. In the 13th edict, he writes about the change of heart caused by the conquest of Kalinga. In Kalinga, many people were killed, and he regrets that. And he approaches government in a different way after that. All these turning points have taken place in what appears to be the first half of his reign. That's important to realize. They go from his first year, which is not mentioned, but they end with the 13th year in his reign. In the pillar edicts next, the king is made to look back at his career from the 26th year. That is 2 times 13. That's not a coincidence. He looks back at his reign, how he has succeeded in reducing the number of animals killed in his realm, and how he had managed to set up a system of delegation in judicial matters. These are just 2 examples. The division, you know, in the first of his reign, you know, the first 13 years of his reign in the Rock Edict series, and the entire reign of 26 years cannot be a coincidence, and points to mutual coordination in preparing the text of these 2 compilations. It's almost an inevitable conclusion. The picture gets even more interesting if we include the so-called 7th pillar edict in our, if we include that in our discussion, then this adds another year to the king's reign, the 27th year. This edict is dated in the 27th year of the king's reign. However, this inscription or this text is not by Aśoka. It is a spurious pseudo Aśoka inscription. It can be shown, it's a very complicated argument. It has to do with the sources on which this inscription is based. It is a very late product. They just wanted to give the king an extra year, apparently. Just now, you see, by the way, I have here a picture, part 1. This is from the proofs I have been reading of my book, and I use it for scribbling my notes on it. Just now I've said that in the Pillar Edict series, the king is made to look back at his own career. I do so because I have found we have to distinguish between the king of the edicts and the persons or the kings who were responsible for the compilation and the inscriptions. how did I come to that conclusion? I will give just 3 points here, which are not the only ones. The first is that the distribution and engraving of the inscriptions have taken place in over a longer period of time. For instance, the Rock Edict series was first sent to Kalinga. By the way, without the edicts 11, 12, and 13 in it. They are later additions, contrary to what has always been assumed, by the way, without any investigation or any, it was just assumed. Was first the Rock Edict series was first sent to Kalinga. Next, it was sent to Gornall in the west, with the 3 edicts 11, 12, and 13 inserted in it, but provisionally inserted in it. Only after the text had been edited to make the insertion more of 11, 12, and 13 smoother, more smooth, was it sent to the other sides. This process must have taken quite a number of years, because in the meantime also other adaptations were carried out in the text, into the text. The second point I like to mention is that the inscribed versions we have of the edicts are edited versions of letters. Letters which the king communicated with the administrative centers in his realm. In the process of editing, the original letters were stripped of features that are typical for letters, such as addresses, like the Mahamatras of Tosali are to be told the following, and then you get the text. And also they were stripped of second person plural pronouns. They were made more general, as if they were addressed to a general public, not to specific persons. From some edicts, we have several versions of the text. And through these versions, we can follow this editorial process, in fact. In one version, they still have the address, for instance, and in another version, the address is removed, and also the character of the text is next changed. This altogether means that the inscriptions represent or are the product of an already existing epistolary tradition. Next, it should be mentioned that the king, it may be asked actually, if the king was not of the edicts, who wrote the text or the letters, was not already dead when the inscriptions were, the text of the inscriptions were distributed. It is much more likely that the inscriptions as we have them are the work of his successors, and that they were made as a tribute to him as a former king who at the time had already acquired a legendary status. In this connection, it is significant to see that in a local version of a minor rock edict, that is an edict I'm not going to deal with here, namely the version in Aghraura, the author of the inscription is identified with a king who would have been crowned a number of years after the Buddha's nirvana. I'm of course talking about King Aśoka here. It should be mentioned also that the name Aśoka is otherwise not found in our text, except as an interpolation in some local versions. The king is usually called Devanam Priya Darsi Raja, or well, the beloved of the gods, the god with a gentle face, the king. These are 3 titles, it cannot be proved that they are personal names. And sometimes for short, by the way, he's only called the beloved of the gods. By the way, the Aghraura version where the king, is dated, or no, the king and the date of the Buddha's nirvana are connected. This is not the only trace of the influence of Buddhist legendary literature on the text of the inscriptions. Another such trace is found in Lumbini, the place of the Buddha's birth. In the inscription that is found there, the king mentions the raising of the inscribed pillar and that's more interesting, the installation of a tree made of stone. That is the tree which the Buddha's mother held on when she gave birth to him, according to Buddhist legendary literature. This involves, by the way, a identification of the mysterious word Vigadabi. Maybe you have ever come across that particular word. It is a corruption of Vidabi, and Vidabi is Pali Vitabi, and that means tree. It is just a word for tree, and there is a reason why it got corrupted here, or it's possible to show. With the discovery of an earlier epistolary tradition, the idea that the text of the inscriptions are based on letters the king had written to his lieutenants in the provinces, we land in, by the discovery of that epistolary tradition, we land in the middle of the controversy about the origin of the Brahmi script. According to some scholars, this script was an invention made by Aśoka for the purpose of having his edicts engraved in rock. Possible early evidence of script is rejected by scholars who, propose this thesis. Apparently in Sri Lanka or Ceylon, earlier traces of script have been found. But the argument is that can't be true because that's before Aśoka. That's short how the argument runs. But well before the engraving of the inscriptions, scribes wrote letters for the king, which could easily be taken along by messengers to far away corners of the realm. So there must already have existed a cursive form of writing that was distinct from the rather angular form found in the inscriptions. Finally, I skip a lot. Finally, I would briefly like to draw attention to the contemporary language policy visible in the inscriptions. There is strong evidence in the text itself themselves that the scribes that were employed in the royal chancery these scribes were steeped in Vedic lore. They probably knew Mimamsa. They use a Vedic expression to sit next to the gods, is the expression. So they must have known the Veda, and they must then also have known Sanskrit. This in turn raises the question why they did not offer the king the use of Sanskrit, the language they had been trained to use. Its supra-regional character would have greatly facilitated communication across the realm, one would think. They did not do so may have to do with the fact that in the edict, the king repeatedly and sometimes literally presents himself as an innovator. He says, I'm the first to do it, to introduce a new kind of policy. He is the author of a new type of kingship. In this respect, he resembles the Buddha, a historical figure who after several ascetic experiments developed something completely new, namely the middle way. For communicating this image of the king, Sanskrit would, however, not have done. Sanskrit is not the medium for writing about new things. It is used for writing about things that had always been there and have no human creator. For this reason, the scribes decided to adopt something that may pass for the local language, namely a Magadha type of language. Interestingly, and now we turn to quite different areas, interestingly, in the northwest in Mansehra and Shahbazgarhi, and the west in Girnar, the texts were translated from this linguistic variety into what must have been the local administrative languages of the areas. Let's say roughly Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Kathiawar. This translation process appears to coincide with the obliteration of the names of the local people who were living there. That is the Paradas in Mansehra and Shahbazgarhi, and the Andakas in Girnar. They were erased, their names were erased or made unrecognizable, and they were found in a list of people who had accepted the king's rule, according to the king's own claim. This raises the question if the translations should not be interpreted as acts of defiance. You know, we accept your inscriptions, but we do it in our own languages. This is it's all you know, it's a kind of language policy which seems to have been present within what Ashoka or the king of the edicts thought was his own realm. They didn't accept his language, apparently. These are just a few examples of the findings presented in my book. The book is on the market, and fortunately everybody can read it now. That's himself or herself. That's probably more easier to digest than when I try to say it in a few minutes I have here. As I've already written in the book itself, in the introduction, writing the book has taken me something like 10 years. That's long, but for one thing, I was not in a hurry. I was retired, so I could do anything else. I could work in a garden, or I can write another article. And sometimes I simply took a break when I felt frustrated if I did not know what to do with a problematic passage. But halfway to the year 2021, I decided to take the plunge and sent a manuscript to Primus Books. Why Primus Books? I was familiar with some of their publications, which look very professional and beautiful. And I also knew that they were interested in books that deal with textual matters. You know, I come from the area of Sanskritist or from the field of Sanskrit, and we have a few publishers who are prepared to publish Sanskrit books or books on languages or on literature, but not. Primus Books is among those publishers who are prepared to take the risk, I sometimes think. The contacts were pleasant from the very beginning. First with Bola Varman and later with Prasun Chatterjee, Abhijit Ghosh, and Santmitra Ghosh. And I have to say I have been actually extremely lucky with the two text editors that were assigned to the project, Jyotika Mansata, who is here present, and Amrapali Sharma. I do not know if she is listening in, who with great tact and patience dealt with my idiosyncrasies, textual and otherwise. Finally, I'm also very grateful to the entire Primus team for organizing this book launch. And I want to end with another note. It is not nice to say that the book looks un-Indian, but one thing I missed in the book, it is the smell. You know, when in the 70s, I ordered books from India and I opened it, I always put my nose in it. It was the first thing I did because there was always a very strong smell in it. And in a way, I have to admit, I miss it sometimes. Maybe you can do something about that. But the book is you know, when I got it and received it, I was really amazed at how it looked. I had seen only proofs, and of course I had seen a photograph of the cover, but not, you know, if you leaf through it, how it looked and how it lies in your hand. It was a great pleasure when I received it, and I really felt gratified. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tieken, not just for your insight into the volume, but for your kind words for everybody. It's really appreciated. And we would like everyone here to see this wonderful book as well. So without further ado, I would like to request Professor Ranabir Chakravarti, Professor Nayanjot Lahiri, and Dr. Alastair Gornall to release the volume and hold it up for everyone here today.
May I hold it up as well?
Of course, sir. Please do.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everybody. Just before we begin our panel discussion, I want to quickly note that if anybody has questions for our author or for our panelists today, please do leave them in the Q&A box and we'll get to them after everyone here has had a chance to speak. And we're eager to hear everyone speak now. So I invite Professor Ranabir Chakravarti to begin the panel discussion today and address everyone here. Professor, you're on mute. Could you please unmute yourself?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Jyotika Mansata, and everyone present here. Very good evening from Kolkata, India. And I'm so very thankful both to the author, Dr. Herman Tieken, a very well-established name in the field of Indological studies, language studies, and he has been publishing for quite some time on Ashokan studies. And I must congratulate, along with him, the publisher Primus for bringing out such a very well produced volume. And it's a technical book, no doubt on this point. It's on inscriptions dealing with absolutely hardcore primary source in primary source language, which are essential tools for studying history. And on the basis of these evidentiary corpus, historians of different generations try to understand events and situations of the past in the light of the present scenario and also with the historiographic baggage, debates and issues. And the outcome of this is the very important collection and anthology of Ashoka's inscriptions, as Dr. Tieken has very clearly pointed out in the subtitle. It's a corpus which he analyzes in this work. I do not know how the choice of me as a discussant came, both two suggested obviously by the author and also the publisher, because I am neither a language scholar nor I am an epigraphist. My interest lies in general in the development of historical situations, more as explanations of the past as a historian rather than in the very specialized areas of epigraphy, source languages, or language scholar. We all, doing ancient India, have to have some at least workable knowledge of a source language, including Sanskrit. And with this, I'll try to say a few words. You have already heard a very lucid overview of the contents of the book by Dr. Tieken, and I heartily congratulate Dr. Tieken on this feat, particularly for the Indian audience and readers. There has been, for a very long time, a very strong and energetic tradition of studying Ashokan inscriptions for understanding one of the most charismatic rulers of Indian history, and also the history of the dynasty belonged to the Mauryas. And along with that, in that particular genre of epigraphic studies, there has been many great authorities, right from the study of Hulsh's work, that is Corpus Inscriptionum Indicarum Volume 1, down to more recent works, particularly the very useful work of Harry Falk, published in 2006. And that is a wonderful source book, as Professor Falk himself called it. For the Indian audience and readers, that book is not very easy to acquire. And many of us somehow procured it through photocopies or some other means, borrowing it from friends. Now, with the availability of Dr. Tieken's book, a major tool of Ashokan studies have come in 2 covers. And the main situation is that with the availability of inscriptions of Ashoka, for the first time with the discovery of the Musk inscription in 1915 by C. Beeden, that actually opened up the vista of Ashokan studies, and particularly then it enriched enormously the Mauryan studies. There is nothing before 1915 that one hears of Ashoka and the Mauryas in the light of inscriptions, because the identity of what is called Devanampiapiyadasi Raja was completely unknown. Even when Sarnath was excavated in 1904, 1905 by Oracle, and the discovery of the very celebrated, the quadruple lion capital figure from Sarnath, nobody knew its context, only the materials came out, till the discovery and identification of the Devanampiapiyadasi Raja with Ashoka, with the reading of the Musk inscriptions. So it is almost about 110 years, not even 110 years, long 110 years of continuous sustained researches on Ashokan studies and Mauryans that has the background of bringing out this very useful volume by Dr. Tieken. Now, he has already told you about what lies in his effort. So I'm not going to repeat that. My only point is for the readers who would definitely pick up the book in near future, is that he planned the book in 2 parts. The first part, having 7 chapters, mainly deals with the readings of pillar edicts, rock edicts, pillar inscriptions, Sanghaveda inscriptions, and the 2 sets of minor rock edict 1 and 2 in 7 chapters. The part 2 is in 5 chapters, where he offers studies, more intricate textual language studies on the inscriptions he has dealt in great details in first part. Dr. Tieken has spoken not in great details, and actually is rather silent, as he also mentioned, on the 7 Greek and Aramaic edicts coming from Afghanistan and 1 from Taxila. And his interest lies in the language, and also what he referred to occasional translation point. And in that sense, I felt perhaps even he very politely says about his limitations in the languages of the Northwest, that is Greek and Aramaic inscriptions. The interesting point, since he's talking about languages, and this was pointed out in 1984 by B.N. Mukherjee. This is the only book available on Aramaic and Greek edicts of Ashoka in a single volume, that these Greek and Aramaic edicts were translations, transliteration, sometimes abridgment of summaries of Ashokan Prakrit edicts, sometimes explanation or elucidations of some of the ideas in Prakrit inscriptions. So there is a process of inter-language play and translation process, and definitely multilinguality current within the vast Mauryan realm. In that case, may I asked Professor Dr. Tieken here, in which a subject he is an expert, that is, along with his Sanskrit and Prakrit Apabhrangsha, very strong grounding, is also a specialist in Tamil language. In the two Rockedic 2 and also in Rockedic 13, Aśoka speaks of the areas Anta Abhijita or Prachanta Pratyanta areas, in which he mentions, along with within the subcontinent, allowing Chodapada, and then Tambapanya, and then Satyaputa, Ketalaputa. Now these two Satyaputa, Ketalaputa, clearly Prakrit terms. And if we take into account that at least by the first centuries BCE, we have Tamil Brahmi inscriptions from the Arcot area, where the Atiyaman, Neduman, Anji inscription came out, indicating that this ruler is not a full-fledged king, maybe a chieftain, inscribing his name as Anji, who is the son, Man, of his father Nedu, and also son or belonging to Atiyaman, which is obviously the Tamil expression of what is called Satya, is therefore the term Cherub, Ketalaputa, and Satyaputa, and Prakrit translation or Prakritization of the Tamil names Cheraman and Atiyaman. If that is so, then Aśoka, though he never used any Dravidian language in his inscription, is aware of is familiar with some of at least the major Dravidian languages current in what is called ancient Tamilakam. And then there is a translation of these two names into Prakrit. And interestingly, the influence of Prakrit, even to the classical authors in later times, continued, as Ketalaputra is translated into Keprabotras or Cherobotras in later classical texts of late 1st centuries BC to about 3rd century CE. Now, with that, I was particularly very interested in the detailed discussion of Dr. Tieken on the what he calls Sanghaveda inscriptions, 3 in particular, and his the way he has juxtaposed the Buddhist textual canonical materials with the inscriptional studies of Sanghaveda, or Aśoka's attempt to keep the unity of the Sangha, is an interesting exercise indeed. Here I would like to only draw a matter of a slightly later times, an inscription from Sanchi, which for the first time figured in Marshall's book on Sanchi. Marshall dated it to 3rd century BC, perhaps not as early as that, maybe 2nd century, where a donor, obviously a pious Buddhist donor, writes about his pious donation of gifting a Vedika, also the railing pillar, a Torana, obviously Sanchi Stupa. Then he says categorically that if someone tries to destroy these or tries to take these monuments away to another shrine, that would bring cars. And then the cars, as he utters, is Matu Ghati, Pitu Ghati, Rudiropai, and finally Saghavedi. So the fear and concern about Sanghaveda is a genuine one in Aśoka's time, and that continues. The very cars that one is Saghavedi is there in not only during the Aśoka's concern, but also continues. This is the first time epigraphic cars has been uttered at Sanchi, where lies one of the Sanghaveda inscriptions. He has pointed out in the book, and also briefly touched upon, one of his cornerstones of his arguments of Aśokan, the nature of Aśokan inscriptions, and also the language. And he talks about the letters, imperial or royal letters issued by the ruler to the future engravers on lithic spaces. and he calls this rightly the epistolary tradition. I'm not sure on this point, to be very frank, because of the particular anonymity that is permeating the entire text of Ashokan inscription, save the 4 almost accidental mention of Ashoka's name, and only once Karubaki, once the Tivara as the prince, and purely accidental mention of the Lipikara Chapara. No person is mentioned by name. The anonymity is a feature of Ashoka inscriptional text, and in anonymity is perhaps not congruent to the idea of epistolary tradition. To me, this was definitely a central draft. A common draft was issued definitely from the apex political center, that is Pataliputra, then distributed with the possibility of summarizing, expanding according to the local needs by the local administrators. That is very clearly indicated actually in the Rock Edict 14, when it says that the inscription would be either Vistata, Majhima, or Sankhita. So it is essentially a draft rather than letters, because letters would have a personal character. It is rather, on the other hand, the conversational style of imperial speech in first person reminds us of at least its precedence in the case of the Darius's inscription, though the tone is completely different. Darius's inscriptions have nothing benign to offer. Ashokan inscriptions are full of benign attitude of the ruler. But the phraseology, the addressing the subjects and the officers in first person, even if in benign way, has only one precedence, that of the Achaemenid inscriptions, particularly Behistun. This is one point, and I would also, I'm a little bit intrigued that at least on 2 or 3 occasions, Dr. Tieken wrote about, when he was discussing in details the minor rock edicts. He says that these are essentially in the peninsular area. Yet the map he has produced, very finely done map on page 288, definitely does include the sites like, say, as he mentioned, Aharaura. Before that, Sahasram, Ratanpurva, right up to Bahapur, or which is very, very much part of the, they are not at all in peninsular India, and not even the cluster, some of the minor rock edicts found in Madhya Pradesh, Rupnath, Gujara, and also the other one at Panguradia. Can this be considered as peninsular situation? These are Central Indian, and in that case, he has rightly pointed out the cluster, the very major concentration of Ashokan inscriptions, particularly minor rock edicts, along with the 2 places of rock edicts, one at Sannati and also at Yeraguddi. Why there is so much interest in the southernmost corner of the vast Mauryan realm, and I think in this case he could have paid a little bit more attention to a recent slim volume published about 4 years back by Sushmita Basu Majumdar, Mauryans in Karnataka, could have been, because particularly this is an epigraphist position, and how the letters were engraved and which kind of rock surfaces, the technical details, and also the use of Prakrit language, the relationship between Suvarnagiri and also Isila complex, as the author argued, could have been discussed a little bit more in detail. Similarly, also the study, in-depth study of the same author, Sushmita Basu Majumdar, on the Ashokan inscription and also Dasharatha's inscription at Parabar and Nagarjuni hills, also could have been taken into a little bit more details. With this, I would I thought that with this very scholarly language studies input and the details of epigraphic materials considered by Dr. Tieken if he would have brought in an overview, particularly for the readers who, whether in India or anywhere else in the world, would like to know about the Mauryan realm. Particularly, this is the really contemporary source materials. We are not very sure of when the Arthashastra was written. One is not about sure if Megasthenes' report was that of an eyewitness account. The text is lost and preserved only in later what may be called the ancient secondary notes. This is the only primary text, and how it reveals the nature of Mauryan realm. Particularly, he has cited several works, including, I found the bibliography quite exhaustive, like the well-known work by Gerhard Fussmann on Central and Provincial Administration, along with a couple of works by Professor Romila Thapar. But in that case, the Maurya is revisited, where in the light of the distribution, like the Bhairaj Rock Edict, where Ashoka not only lays down what the ideal text, this kind of syllabus course for the Bhikshu will be required, but also consider Magadha Raje. That is basically a Magadha ruler. That is the metropolitan area of the empire, as Professor Thapar pointed out, and there are core regions. If there is a core, then the question of a periphery. And a periphery, there are two peripheries, very clearly one periphery in the northwest and in the deep south. In the deep south, long time back, Efar Olchin pointed out that the urge for getting mineral resources, including gold digging, probably attracted Mauryas to this area, and therefore that their interest in having so many inscriptions of Ashoka in a compact zone in the Karnataka, and particularly Karnataka and adjoining western part of Andhra Pradesh. Before I end, I have a query to Dr. Tieken, who can point it out later if time permits, that in the otherwise very well prepared bibliography, the primary source contains only Sanskrit edited texts. The inscriptions volumes he has used, like that of Hulsh, of Senar, of K.L. Jannard, and many others. These edited volumes with translations have come under secondary sources. Are inscriptions to be seen as secondary sources? And I think Dr. Tieken would like to see his work as a primary source. We would use this book as a primary source, not as a secondary material. And including the book by Patrick Oliver on the Arthashastra, his latest translation, along with commentaries on the Arthashastra, figures in the secondary sources. Will the excavated reports of excavations be considered as secondary sources? And this is something, a little bit of an intrigue I have, and I think this book will bring many more interested readers and scholars, a little bit technical reading of this wonderful scholarship. And I'm happy that this technical expertise and the rigor of scholarship writ large in this book and wonderfully brought about by Dr. Tieken is dished out rather than a very simplified kind of overview of a technical issue. And that is the achievement of the author and the book. And thank you very much for considering me to offer a few words on the book. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Chakravarti. I now invite our second panelist, Professor Nayanjot Lahiri, to address viewers today and give her perspective.
It's a pleasure to be part of this panel, and I want to begin by congratulating Herman Tieken for his wonderful new work. It's already been pointed out by Ranabir that Emperor Ashoka has actually fascinated generations of writers and scholars. Actually, rulers who enjoy tremendous power over large territories, as did Ashoka, are all compelling figures, no matter what their eventual legacy. But I think what makes Ashoka different from many long-lived kings and emperors was that he was not a faceless ruler. He made himself visible through his words. So I think it's perfectly in order that there is this huge number of books and articles on him. Harry Fawkes' very detailed bibliography actually contains 1,800 entries. There are writings on the texts, the translations, there are works on archaeology and historical geography, as also on the emperor's ideas, his image in the literature of Asia, and of course, the fascinating discovery of the epigraphs and of the emperor in those epigraphs. But since that was published, there have been several more writings, and the most recent is this very hefty work of Herman Tieken, the Aśoka Inscriptions. Dr. Tieken, this is definitely a labor of love. It appears to be the culmination of a very long engagement with those epigraphs, on which you've been working, as you yourself put it in the book, off and on since 1996. I see this as a painstaking literary study of the inscriptions in a variety of ways, for instance, in relation to how they are inscribed, as also in the way in which the texts are analyzed. So on the engraving, I think a lot of readers will learn new things, as for instance, from Herman Tieken's analysis of the Delhi Topra pillar, that while, engraving the text, after the first column was put down, the pillar was actually rolled to the right instead of the left. And consequently, Pillar Edict 4 came to be written to the left of Pillar Edicts 1 and 3. I know Professor Tieken does not see himself as somebody who deals with the materiality of the surfaces and the artifacts on which these inscriptions are. But a remark like that gives you a sense that he is very interested in questions of materiality. He sees these epigraphs, as he's told us, as a very well-defined corpus of complementary texts. And for that reason, I think he believes that they can be approached in the same way as one analyzes the works of, ancient Indian poets like Kalidas and Bana. In fact, he does draw attention on a number of occasions to references that are there in the epigraphs, which are also there in the texts. So if I was to give you one example, when he looks at the definition of Guna Madhurya in the Natya Shastra, he notes that that describes it thus: when a sentence has been heard many times or has been said again and again, nevertheless, this does not cause any annoyance. We speak of the guna of Madhurya. And this is literally how we should read a sentence in Rock Edict 4, Tieken tells us, where, the charm of stating certain topics again and again is reiterated. I do want to say there, though, the merit of raising a topic again and again could also be to underline the significance of certain messages. It's much in the way in which religious preachers sermonize, that the key messages are repeated, time and again. And this, after all, Ashoka, that is, was a sermonizing monarch. So, that's something that you might think of considering. The idea of actually seeing the epigraphs as a well-defined corpus of complementary texts is also and very importantly highlighted through the internal evidence. So, for instance, the Sangha Veda or the Schism Edict and the minor rock edicts are seen in the book as being related in the sense that each covers a particular phase in the annual calendar of the Buddhist monks. So the Sangha Veda edict, Herman Tieken tells us is related to the rainy season because it seems to be dealing with monks who are leading a sedentary life, while Minor Rock Edict 1 is when the monastic community is roaming around in the dry period of the year. In both of them, he tells us that the king presents himself as a lay follower and as an active supporter of the Buddhist community. And in contrast to this, when he looks at the major rock and pillar edicts, he stresses the importance and that this is different from the minor rock edict and from the Sangha Veda edict of supporting all religious communities. So it's much more broad-based. And, I would agree with that. And it's really fascinating, Dr. Tieken, when you point out in discussing Pillar Edict 5 in your chapter on the composition of the Pillar Edict series, that the holy days actually present a mixture. It's a good example of what you talk about supporting all religious communities. It's a mixture of Buddhist and Vedic Brahmanic days. But here, of course, I should add that there are rock edicts where a Buddhist flavor is actually sought to be intentionally added. So, for instance, if you think of sculptural art, Dhauli in Odisha is one such place where the epigraph actually refers to the stunning sculpted elephant monument that is there and to what this elephant represents. So at the end of the 6th rock edict at Dhauli is inscribed the appellation Seto, or the white one. And this is an allusion to the Buddha, because it was as a white elephant that the Buddha was supposed to have entered his mother's womb. So I would say that those who were looking at the Dhauli rock, the messaging was of two types. There was one, the messaging from the words, but even there was this one word which actually was complementary to the sculpture itself. The problem of violence in relation to both human beings and other living beings is a theme that the Ashokan edicts are saturated with. And here in this book, this is reiterated again and again in the readings. So, for instance, when you talk about Rock Edict 13, you see 3 types of conquest being reviewed with a successive decrease in violence. The first type of conquest is the invasion of Kalinga, which of course is accompanied by great violence, resulting in huge loss of life, among other things. The second type you see is a mere show of power, where it's used against the people of the jungle, the Atavi. And in the third type of conquest, you say that no force or violence is used. It's really directed at people who lived on the border or beyond the borders of his realm. But I would not see that as conquest. I would see that as victory, really, because the term used is Dhamma Vijaya, which is more like a spiritual victory rather than a conquest. The manner in which when Ashok talks about Kalinga or the jungle people is somewhat qualitatively different. But on the whole, I think, your work does give a sense that there are alternative, non-violent ways of engaging with people, whether it is your own subjects or those who were resisting you or those who were beyond your political sphere who you were engaging with. But since Kalinga and the Atavi are mentioned one after the other, I also think it's not just a question of seeing a successive decrease in violence in these words. There is also a recognition that a king would have to use coercive force when needed if moral persuasion did not succeed. Ashoka is not only about compassion, and I think a ruler 2000 years back and rulers even today have to really scheme and control in order to sustain, their rule. And the exercise of power, whether it is today or in the time of Ashoka, really inevitably entailed the use of force, and that comes through in, the Rock Edict 13. But on the whole, I would say that personally, I've gained a great deal from reading this work. And it's a work that scholars for a long time will dip into, both for its rich literary and textual analysis and for the other conclusions which you talked about in your opening remarks. The meanings of words, the reasons why they should be translated in a particular way, or why certain edicts were either omitted or modified. All of this is analyzed in wonderful detail. At the same time, I'm not convinced, and I suspect that many historians will feel the same way, that Emperor Ashoka only commissioned letters and never got inscriptions prepared. And the epigraphs were actually prepared by later Mauryan rulers. I think this is among the most novel, sections, among the most novel ideas in the book, and also the most likely to, lead to very vigorous debate. But I think that's what books are for.
And for
And I'm sure, like me, you must be really looking forward to the arguments and debates that this is, this is going to spawn. So thank you very much for having produced this wonderful book.
Thank you very much for your kind words.
Thank you so much, Professor Lahiri. I would now like to invite our final panelist this evening, Dr. Alastair Gornall, to say a few words.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this book launch. I would like to firstly, wholeheartedly congratulate Herman Tieken on the publication of this wonderful book on the Aśoka Inscriptions. It was a thoroughly delightful thing to read, and I think it's the culmination of over 2 decades of Dr. Tieken's philological research on these edicts. So I'm a historian of religion, but I'm not a specialist on the Aśoka inscriptions. And I found Herman's work incredibly valuable in highlighting how many of the edicts I was familiar with were in fact far more philologically problematic than I had been aware previously. And so that was very interesting for me. And I think, in a sense, one of the major contributions of this book for the non-specialist is the painstaking philological and educational work that Herman has undertaken in analyzing these edicts, line by line in all their problematic detail. And the approach, I think, to the inscriptions is also particularly admirable. This idea of focusing on the whole corpus and also situate as a coherent whole and situating it alongside relevant Sanskrit, Prakrit, and Pali literature, showing Dr. Tieken's vast learning at its best, really reveals a lot of details that may have been missed previously. And this kind of contextual approach allows him to intervene in debates on a number of interpretations of the edicts and to offer some new innovative linguistic solutions. So as a historian of Buddhism, I was particularly interested in Dr. Tieken's interpretations of the so-called Schism Edict and the first minor rock edict, which has already been mentioned by Professor Lahiri. And so similarly, I found particularly thought-provoking Herman's argument in the book, which he develops on his earlier work, that the Schism Edict represents Ashoka's attempt to kind of support the Sangha in attaining this uniformity, this samagga, and that we can understand the opening of the Schism Edict as a kind of new disciplinary formula, a type of kamavacha of sorts, to be used by the Sangha to expel quarrelsome monks from the community. So I found that very interesting. And throughout the book, Herman is also very attentive to textual variations between different versions of an inscription, and shows, particularly in the case of the Schism Edict, I found this interesting, how variations in the 3 versions of the edict reflect the differing kind of political realities in the regions where the inscriptions are found. I thought that was very insightful. And I was also struck too by Dr. Tieken's observation that the Schism Edict and the first Minor Rock Edict pertain to distinct, as mentioned by Professor Lahiri, distinct kind of, but yet complementary, I think, phases in the life of Buddhist monks. So it's interesting to think about the idea that this Schism Edict pertains to the kind of communal life of the Sangha during the rainy season, while the Minor Rock Edict 1 addresses Ashoka's touring of the countryside as an upasaka in imitation of the monks' wanderings during the dry season. And I think Herman also fascinatingly suggests that this distinction of purpose between the two is reflected in the geographical distribution of the inscriptions as well, as was mentioned by Dr. Tieken in his opening. So the Sangha Veda or Schism Edict is found at Buddhist establishments such as Sanat and Sanchi, whereas the Minor Rock Edicts, which deal with monks' mobility, are located on traveling routes at the frontiers of the realm. So I think this is a wonderful contribution and a very interesting insight. So in this regard, throughout the book, I found particularly stimulating Herman's suggestions about the developmental connections between certain courtly and monastic practices. So, for instance, Herman connects the Buddhist Uposatha ceremony with the royal Akshapatpalas rites, and as mentioned, cites the monastic practice of wandering in the dry season as an inspiration for Ashoka's own world tours. So, this idea of the complementary genesis of monastic and courtly practices is something that I will certainly continue to think about in my own work. And I should say also that another important insight related to Buddhism in the book is that Dr. Tieken clearly shows that the Ashokan corpus maintained a pluralistic religious outlook, as shown in particular, I think, in his excellent discussion of the Minor Rock Edict 2. And that even in Ashoka's most Buddhist edicts, the imagery and vocabulary that is used is generally Vedic, which I found, again, surprising to me, because I necessarily haven't looked at these inscriptions in much detail, but when I was reading about that, it struck me as to be quite true. And it could well be, as Dr. Tieken speculates, that this suggests perhaps that Brahmin officials may have played important roles in composing these works. And also, I think maybe there's a question as well in the back of my mind about how much Ashoka actually understood Buddhist thought, and whether he was simply, speaking about a new religious tradition in terms that may have been more familiar with him. But I'm not so sure. I'm not an expert, so. But overall, then, I would say that Dr. Tieken's book is a wonderful contribution, and I expect it certainly to stimulate future discussion and debate. I'm very intrigued by the idea that writing existed prior to Ashoka's reign, and that the inscriptions are perhaps based on letters sent by the king. I think, as Professor Lahiri has pointed out, this will be, I think, a nice point for people to discuss as we move forward. As a historian of Sri Lanka, I'm of course aware of Brahmi inscribed pot shards that archaeologists and epigraphists have found on the island, and I really enjoyed that section in the book. It's very useful for me, actually, in terms of what I'm writing at the moment. And there's been a lot of subsequent debates about whether these shards predate Ashoka or not, but again, I have to admit my own failings in the sense I'm neither an archaeologist or an epigraphist. And so some of that debate is a little bit beyond me in terms of being able to, for me to be able to say categorically which side I'm on in that sense. But I also hope that Dr. Tieken's book will serve to revive interest in the Ashokan inscriptions among younger scholars. As I said at the beginning, I think perhaps one of the most impactful things about the book for a general academic audience is that it shows clearly how much that is often considered to be settled fact in our field is still very much open to debate. And that there's a lot of exciting work that can still be done on the Ashokan corpus. And I think this wonderful book will lead many of us to take up the study of these incredibly valuable inscriptions again. So I just wish to thank you, Herman, for putting in all this mighty effort in producing this book, and it's a wonderful achievement. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gornall. And speaking of keeping things open for discussion and debate, we have a question actually for Dr. Tieken. This question is from Dr. S.M. Jha, who says, in the 4th pillar edict, there are 2 words, Vyohal Samata and Dand Samata. Epigraphists have conventionally translated these words as impartiality in judicial proceedings and impartiality in punishment. He thinks that these words should be translated as equality in judicial proceedings and equality in punishment. So the administration of justice based not on the Varna system, but crime based. So he would like, Dr. Tieken, he would like your perspective, your comments on this.
Yes. I missed one point though. They were mentioned in what pillar edict? No, they are mentioned in a rock edict, isn't it? Or
it says the Delhi Topra edict.
Delhi Topra.
Fourth edict. Yes.
I have to look because I'm
4th pillar edict.
Fourth pillar edict.
The 4th pillar edict. Oh, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong edict. I don't remember that. Now, well, I know the terms from a different context. They are dealt with in the so-called, in other edicts. They are mentioned in a separate edict. These terms are found, and I think in the 2nd one. I don't think generally. I'm now talking generally. I don't think that caste plays a role here, a very great role in that sense. It's it is equality in the sense of not equality, but it is it's. Sorry, I'm somewhat at a loss. I haven't prepared anything about terms, so. And I can't find it in the pillar edict, to be honest. The 4th pillar edict, it's, in the 4th pillar edict, he says that he has relegated the punishment of criminals to his lieutenants in the provinces. That's what he says, and then. He says they should be, and then what he also says is that they should, well, he relegates it to these officials in the realm, in the provinces. And he says they should, he leaves it to their discretion to do what they have to do. But yeah, I don't have the original text in front of me. I have the I can't find it in this text, so I cannot react properly. I mean,
perhaps you could comment on the difference that Dr. Jha has pointed out within versus say impartiality in judicial proceedings or punishment versus say equality. Did Ashoka discuss that?
I don't think for Ashoka Varna or caste would make any difference. He doesn't talk. He mentions Brahmins, okay, but Brahmins are for him just scholars he can use in the administration when he mentions them, or they are a specific religious group, like well, he also mentions, that he does mention caste in the context of that good people maintain the rule that if you have a guest, the guest is allowed to eat first. And the guest is usually then probably a Brahmin, or that's Agra Bhukti. It's found in one of the texts. But in punishment, I don't. Yeah, it depends on the word samatha in this context, and I wouldn't be able to react to this detailed question now. I will keep it in mind. If you mail me the email address or the name of the person who asked the question, I can direct my reply directly.
Sure, Dr. Tieken, I know him, and I'll sort of put you in touch with Dr. Jha.
Yeah, okay. Thank
It
you.
definitely does give us plenty of food for thought and leaves things open for further discussions, which, as I think we've come to understand, is what the basis of good research is. We want to address questions, but also leave things open for future scholars and for people to be interested in to research. So thank you so much, Dr. Tieken, for answering the question. But
I should thank you for organizing this book launch, actually.
But with that, it is unfortunate that I don't think we have any further questions. But thank you to Dr. Jha for posing such an interesting question for everyone to think about.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, we're running short on time. So
yes.
It is with.
Yeah, I will mail Professor Chakravarti my replies to him later on. I will do.
Before we end this wonderful discussion that we've had here tonight, I'd just like to thank a few people. So from all of us here at Primus Books, I would first like to extend our thanks to the audience watching, who took the time to join us this evening and listen to tonight's insightful discussions. We hope you will enjoy reading this volume as much as you enjoyed this evening's interaction. I would like to extend our sincere thanks to Mr. Sugat Jain, the Managing Director of Primus and Ratna Sagar, who has encouraged and fostered the publication of academic research all these years, following the vision of his father, Dr. Dhanesh Jain. We are so grateful for this dedication and support for academic publishing, a sentiment that I'm sure is echoed by all readers as well. I must also thank our eminent panelists this evening, Professor Ranabir Chakravarti, Professor Nayanjot Lahiri, and Dr. Alastair Gornall for their discussion of the Aśoka Inscriptions. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us here tonight. It has been a pleasure to have you here with us and to hear your thoughts and perspectives on the themes of this volume. I would also like to thank Dr. Herman Tieken for allowing us to publish the Aśoka Inscriptions. We are grateful that you trusted Primus Books to bring out this volume, which provides such a different take on the Ashokan inscriptions and epistolary traditions in the subcontinent. We are sure this volume will draw in readers with all its in-depth research. Finally, I would like to thank Mr. B.N. Verma, founder and head of Primus Books, for all his support, help, and encouragement at Primus. Thank you all of us for being with us here tonight. Good evening. Have a very good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you,
Bye.
Professor Chakravarti. Thank you, Dr. Gornall.
Thank you,
Dr.
everyone.
Tieken.
Thank you,
Yes,
Herman.
thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye, everyone.